The grocery store checkout line stretched endlessly ahead, filled with tired parents juggling screaming toddlers and elderly customers counting exact change. Sarah Martinez stood patiently behind her cart, her 5-year-old daughter Emma tugging at her sleeve, when a whisper started. "Look at her," came a snide voice from behind. "Thinks she's some kind of superhero or something." Sarah glanced down at her outfit. A simple red cape draped over her shoulders that Emma had insisted she wear for their superhero shopping adventure. What had started as innocent mother-daughter fun was now drawing unwanted attention from a group of teenagers who found her appearance amusing. "Superman? Really?" One of them laughed loudly. "What's next? Gonna fly over the produce section?" Their mocking grew louder, attracting stares from other shoppers. Emma's grip on her mother's hand tightened, confusion and hurt flickering across her small face as she watched strangers laugh at something that had brought them both such joy moments earlier. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she held her head high. She had learned long ago that people's opinions couldn't define her worth. Still, watching her daughter's excitement dim because of cruel strangers made her heart ache. What none of these mockers knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the quiet woman they were ridiculing was married to a man who had spent his life defending the very freedom that allowed them to speak so carelessly. A man whose return from deployment was still days away, but whose presence was about to change everything in ways no one could predict. Sometimes the most ordinary moments become extraordinary not because of what happens, but because of who steps forward when it matters most. This is one of those stories. A reminder that heroes don't always wear capes, but sometimes they're married to people who do. Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who found magic in ordinary moments. That Tuesday afternoon in late September, she stood in the cereal aisle of Miller's Grocery, watching her 5-year-old daughter Emma debate the merits of various breakfast options with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice. "The green box has a better superhero," Emma declared, holding up a box of cereal featuring a cartoon character in a flowing cape. "And Mom, superheroes need good breakfast to save the world." Sarah smiled, remembering when life felt that simple, before deployments became a regular part of their vocabulary, before she learned to sleep alone in a bed that felt too big, listening for sounds that never came, before she became both mother and father to a little girl who asked why Daddy had to go save other people when she needed saving from monsters under her bed. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart," Sarah agreed, adding the cereal to their cart. "Superheroes definitely need proper nutrition." Emma's face lit up with inspiration. "Mom, we should be superheroes today. You can wear my cape from the costume box." The red satin cape had been a birthday gift from Emma's grandmother, part of a superhero costume that had seen countless adventures around their small apartment. Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing around the store at the other shoppers going about their mundane Tuesday routines. "Please, Mom." Emma's eyes sparkled with the kind of pure joy that made saying no impossible. "We could be the super shopping squad." Sarah looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and made a decision that would change both their lives in ways she couldn't imagine. "Okay, Super Emma, let's do this." The transformation happened in the store's family restroom. Emma carefully draped the cape around her mother's shoulders, adjusting it with the precision of a royal dresser. "There, now you look like a real superhero, Mom. Just like Daddy." The comparison caught Sarah off guard. Emma often compared things to her father, David, who had been deployed for 3 months with his Navy SEAL team. In Emma's mind, her daddy was the ultimate superhero, strong, brave, and capable of solving any problem. Sarah had spent countless nights trying to fill that void, reading bedtime stories with different voices, assembling complicated toys, and answering impossible questions about why bad people existed in the world. "Do I really look like a superhero?" Sarah asked, catching her reflection in the restroom mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her jeans were comfortable rather than fashionable, and dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights. But with the red cape draped over her shoulders, something shifted. Emma saw a superhero, and maybe that was enough. The most beautiful superhero ever, Emma declared with 5-year-old certainty. They emerged from the restroom to continue their shopping adventure. Emma skipped alongside the cart, occasionally stopping to strike superhero poses that made other customers smile. For the first time in months, Sarah felt light. The cape swished behind her as they moved through the store, and she found herself standing a little straighter, walking with a confidence she had forgotten she possessed. In the produce section, they encountered Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived in their apartment complex. Mrs. Henderson's face broke into a wide grin when she saw them. "Well, if it isn't the neighborhood super duo," she exclaimed. "Emma, you look absolutely powerful today." "Mom's a superhero too," Emma announced proudly. "See her cape? She's going to save the world." Mrs. Henderson nodded seriously. "I can see that. The world is lucky to have her." The interaction filled Sarah with warmth. This was what she had hoped for. A simple afternoon of making memories with her daughter, creating joy in the midst of their adjusted reality. They continued shopping, Emma adding items to their cart, while providing running commentary about which foods would give them superhero strength. "Bananas have potassium," Emma declared with authority. "Potassium makes you strong like Daddy." "Where did you learn that?" Sarah asked, impressed by her daughter's knowledge. "Daddy told me before he left. He said bananas would help me grow big and strong while he's gone." David had indeed spent his last days before deployment teaching Emma about nutrition, about taking care of herself and her mother. He had wanted to leave them with tools for independence, practical knowledge wrapped in love. Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest, pride in her husband's thoughtfulness mixed with longing for his presence. They made their way through the pharmacy section, where Sarah picked up Emma's vitamins and her own prescription for anxiety medication. The bottle rattled softly as she placed it in the cart, a sound that reminded her of the adjustments she had made to cope with single parenting and constant worry about David's safety. "Mom, why do you take those pills?" Emma asked with the blunt curiosity of a child. Sarah paused, considering how to explain anxiety to a 5-year-old. "Sometimes grown-ups need help staying calm when they're worried about people they love. Like how I need my nightlight when I'm scared." "Exactly like that, sweetheart. Everyone needs different things to feel safe." Emma nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the same seriousness she applied to her superhero persona. "Daddy keeps us safe when he's here, and the pills keep you safe when he's gone." The simplicity of Emma's understanding both touched and broke Sarah's heart. Children had a way of distilling complex emotions into manageable concepts. If only adult life could be so straightforward. They moved through the store methodically, Sarah checking items off her carefully organized list while Emma provided entertainment and occasional practical suggestions. The cape had become a conversation starter. Several shoppers had smiled or commented positively, and Emma basked in the attention. In the clothing section, they picked up new socks for Emma and a warm sweater for Sarah. The autumn weather was arriving early, and Sarah had learned to prepare for temperature drops that might keep them indoors for days. Having adequate supplies had become a security measure, a way to maintain control in a life that often felt unpredictable. "This sweater is superhero blue," Emma observed, examining Sarah's selection. "Blue is a good color for saving people." "Why is that?" Sarah asked. "Because it's calm and strong, like the ocean where Daddy works." Another unexpected reference to David. Emma processed his absence by connecting everything to him, finding ways to keep him present in their daily experiences. Sarah had learned to welcome these moments rather than feel sad about them. David's influence on their daughter would continue whether he was physically present or not. They approached the meat counter, where Sarah ordered chicken for the week's meals. The butcher, a friendly man named Frank who had been working at the store for decades, smiled when he saw them. "Looking good today, ladies," he said, wrapping their order. "Special occasion? We're superheroes today," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "Mom's wearing her cape to help save the world." Frank nodded with mock seriousness. "Well, the world certainly needs more heroes like you two. You're setting a good example for everyone else." As they waited for their order, Sarah reflected on how different this shopping trip felt compared to their usual routine. Normally, grocery shopping was a necessary chore, something to be completed efficiently while managing Emma's energy and attention span. Today, it had become an adventure, a chance to see their ordinary world through the lens of imagination and possibility. The cape had become more than a costume piece. It was a symbol of the strength Sarah had been building during David's deployment, the courage she summoned each day to be both parents to Emma, to maintain their household, to stay connected with David despite the distance and communication limitations. She thought about the other military spouses she knew, women and men who were navigating similar challenges with remarkable grace. They formed an informal support network, sharing resources and encouragement, watching each other's children during appointments, celebrating small victories, and providing comfort during difficult moments. Sarah had initially resisted joining spouse groups, wanting to maintain her independence and prove she could handle everything alone. But she had learned that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a practical strategy for survival and success. The cape she wore today was a visual representation of the inner strength she had discovered, strength that came not from isolation, but from community and connection. As they finished shopping and headed toward the checkout lines, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond completing errands. They had created a positive experience together, found joy in an ordinary Tuesday, and strengthened their bond during a challenging period of their lives. Emma chatted excitedly about their superhero shopping adventure, already planning future missions and discussing what powers they would need for different challenges. Sarah listened with genuine interest, amazed by her daughter's creativity and resilience. The checkout line stretched ahead of them, filled with other shoppers completing their own versions of this routine task. Sarah adjusted Emma's position in the cart and prepared to wait patiently, feeling proud of their successful shopping trip and the special memory they had created together. Little did she know that their superhero adventure was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test her strength in ways she never anticipated, and remind her that sometimes heroes appear when you least expect them, wearing the faces of the people who love you most. The checkout line at Miller's Grocery moved with the typical Tuesday afternoon sluggishness that Sarah had grown accustomed to over the years. She stood behind their full cart, Emma perched on the child seat, swinging her legs and humming a made-up superhero theme song. The red cape still draped over Sarah's shoulders, and she had forgotten about it completely until the whisper started. "Oh my God, look at that woman," came a voice from somewhere behind them. Sarah's attention had been focused on organizing their items for checkout when the comment reached her ears. She turned slightly, catching sight of a group of teenagers clustered together 3 customers back. They appeared to be high school students, probably around 16 or 17, with the kind of confident swagger that came from traveling in packs. "Is she seriously wearing a cape to the grocery store?" one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. Emma looked up at her mother, confusion flickering across her small face. "Mom, what are they talking about?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. People sometimes say things without thinking." But the teenagers weren't finished. Their voices grew louder, fueled by each other's amusement and the assumption that their target couldn't or wouldn't respond. "Superman? Really?" A girl with bleached blonde hair laughed. "What's next? Gonna fly over the produce section?" Her friends erupted in giggles, and other customers began turning to look. Sarah felt exposed under their stares, some curious, others sympathetic, a few clearly entertained by the spectacle unfolding in the checkout line. "Maybe she thinks she can leap tall buildings in a single bound," added another boy, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or catch bullets with her bare hands." Sarah's hands tightened on the shopping cart handle. She had faced challenges before: David's deployments, single parenting, financial stress, the constant worry about his safety. But public humiliation wasn't something she had prepared for. The cape that had made her feel confident and playful now felt like a target painted on her back. Emma's superhero humming had stopped. She sat quietly in the cart, her young mind trying to process why strangers were laughing at something that had brought them so much joy just minutes earlier. "Mom," Emma whispered, "are they laughing at us?" Before Sarah could answer, the blonde girl's voice cut through the ambient store noise again. "I mean, seriously, lady. Halloween was months ago. Time to rejoin reality." The comment stung more than Sarah expected. Reality. As if she wasn't intimately familiar with reality. As if she didn't wake up every morning to an empty bed and go to sleep every night wondering if her husband was safe. As if she didn't check her phone obsessively for messages that might not come. As if she didn't carry the weight of being a single parent while maintaining hope for her daughter and strength for herself. The line moved forward slightly, but the teenagers seemed energized by their audience. Their commentary continued, each comment building on the last, growing bolder with each laugh they earned from their small crowd. "Maybe she's having a midlife crisis," suggested one of the boys. Trying to recapture her youth, or whatever. "Or she's just completely lost it," the blonde added. "Some people can't handle being adults." Sarah felt Emma's small hand slip into hers. The gesture was protective. Her 5-year-old daughter trying to comfort her mother in the face of something she didn't fully understand but recognized as wrong. The elderly woman directly in front of them turned around with a disapproving look aimed at the teenagers. "Some people," she said loudly enough for them to hear, "don't have enough kindness in their hearts to recognize joy when they see it." But the teenagers seemed to interpret any attention as encouragement. Their laughter grew louder, and their comments became more personal. "Look, she's got her kid with her too," one of them observed. "Teaching the next generation to be weird." That comment crossed a line for Sarah. She could tolerate attacks on herself, but involving Emma was unacceptable. She turned around fully to face them for the first time. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Could you please keep your comments to yourselves? My daughter doesn't need to hear this." The blonde girl smirked. "Oh, she talks. We were wondering if superheroes could communicate with us regular people." Her friends burst into fresh laughter, apparently delighted by what they perceived as a clever comeback. Other customers in line began shifting uncomfortably, some looking away to avoid becoming involved, others showing signs of irritation with the disruption. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anxiety building in her chest, the same feeling she got when David missed a scheduled call or when unexpected bills arrived in the mail. Her heart rate increased, and she could feel sweat beginning to form despite the store's air conditioning. "I'm just trying to have a nice day with my daughter," Sarah said, her voice quieter now, but still audible to those nearby. "Then, maybe choose a costume that doesn't make you look like a crazy person," the blonde replied, her tone growing more aggressive. "Some of us don't want to shop around whatever fantasy you're living in." Emma's grip on Sarah's hand tightened. "Mom, can we go home?" she whispered. The simple question broke Sarah's heart. Emma's excitement about their superhero adventure had evaporated, replaced by confusion and a desire to escape. The magical afternoon they had been sharing was dissolving under the weight of strangers' cruelty. "We'll be done soon, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, but she could hear the shakiness in her own voice. The teenagers seemed to sense victory. Their comments became more pointed, designed to elicit maximum discomfort. "I bet her husband is so embarrassed," one of them said. "Can you imagine coming home to that?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly. If only they knew that her husband was thousands of miles away, risking his life for their freedom to express themselves, even when they chose to use that freedom to hurt others. If only they understood that the cape was a symbol of the strength she had found during his absence, not a sign of instability or attention-seeking. The line moved again, and Sarah found herself close enough to the cashier to see the end of this ordeal approaching. But the teenagers weren't finished with their entertainment. "Maybe she thinks if she dresses like a superhero, someone will actually notice her," the blonde said, her voice carrying clearly through the checkout area. "Desperate much." Other customers were beginning to react more visibly now. An older man shook his head in disgust at the teenagers' behavior. A mother with young children pulled them closer clearly uncomfortable with the language and tone being used. Even the cashiers were exchanging glances, unsure whether to intervene in a situation that hadn't technically violated any store policies. Sarah felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give these strangers the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She had survived 3 deployments, managed a household budget on military pay, and helped her daughter navigate the emotional complexities of having a father in a dangerous job. She was stronger than their words. But strength didn't make the humiliation hurt less. It didn't erase the fact that what should have been a beautiful memory with Emma was being poisoned by people who didn't know them and didn't care about the damage they were causing. "Emma," Sarah said softly, "do you remember what Daddy always tells us about people who try to make others feel small?" Emma nodded, though tears were visible in her eyes. "He says they're the ones who are really small inside." "That's right. And what do we do when people try to make us feel bad about being ourselves?" "We remember that their opinion doesn't change who we are," Emma recited, clearly repeating a lesson David had taught her. The blonde teenager had apparently heard this exchange. Oh great, now she's giving life lessons. Maybe she thinks she's a superhero teacher too. But something in Emma's repetition of her father's words had strengthened Sarah's resolve. David had indeed taught them both about dealing with bullies, drawing from his military experience and his understanding of human nature. He had prepared them for challenges, including this one, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Sarah straightened her shoulders, the cape settling more firmly around them. She wouldn't remove it or apologize for wearing it. She wouldn't let these strangers dictate how she chose to spend time with her daughter or what brought them joy. The elderly woman in front of them had reached the cashier and was being checked out. Sarah would be next, and this ordeal would end soon. But the damage had been done. Emma's enthusiasm for their superhero game had been crushed, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of protecting her daughter from a world that could be unnecessarily cruel. As they prepared to move forward in line, Sarah made a mental note to talk with Emma later about what had happened, to help her process the experience and maintain her sense of self-worth despite the stranger's words. She would also need to find ways to restore the magic they had been sharing before it was interrupted. What Sarah didn't know was that across town, her husband David was making his final preparations to return home early from deployment. His unit had completed their mission ahead of schedule, and he was planning to surprise his family. He had no way of knowing that his wife and daughter needed him at that very moment, but military families develop instinct about such things. The teenagers continued their commentary as the line moved forward, unaware that their behavior was being observed by someone who would soon make his presence known in a way they never expected. Sometimes justice arrives wearing civilian clothes, and sometimes heroes show up exactly when they're needed most. David Martinez stepped through the sliding glass doors of Miller's Grocery with the measured pace of someone accustomed to scanning environments for threats and opportunities. After 8 months of deployment in hostile territory, the fluorescent-lit normalcy of suburban America felt both comforting and strange. His duffel bag was in the rental car outside. He had driven straight from the airport, eager to surprise Sarah and Emma with his early return. The original plan had been to go home first, but he remembered Sarah mentioning in their last video call that Tuesday afternoons were their grocery shopping time. The thought of seeing their faces when he appeared unexpectedly in the store made him smile as he grabbed a basket and began navigating the aisles, looking for his family. David's trained senses picked up the disturbance before he could locate its source. Raised voices, uncomfortable tension, the kind of energy that indicated conflict in a space where people expected peace. His military instincts kicked in automatically, and he found himself moving toward the checkout area where the commotion seemed to be centered. What he saw when he rounded the corner stopped him cold. His wife stood in the checkout line wearing a red cape, holding their daughter's hand while a group of teenagers behind them provided running commentary about her appearance. Even from a distance, David could see the rigid set of Sarah's shoulders, the way she was holding herself together through sheer willpower. Emma looked confused and upset, her earlier joy clearly diminished by whatever was happening. David's jaw tightened as he caught fragments of the teenagers' conversation. Words like crazy and desperate and embarrassing floated toward him, and he felt a familiar surge of protective anger. The same feeling that had driven him through countless missions where innocent people needed defending. But this was different. This was his family. He positioned himself where he could observe without being noticed, assessing the situation with the thoroughness that had kept him alive in war zones. For teenagers, probably juniors or seniors in high school, feeding off each other's energy and the attention they were attracting, other customers were uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Store employees seemed unsure how to handle a situation that wasn't technically against any rules. Sarah was handling it with grace, but David could see the cost. He knew her tells, the way her left hand clenched when she was fighting anxiety, the slight tremor in her voice where she was overwhelmed but trying to stay strong. 8 months of video calls and text messages had made him hyper-aware of every nuance of her emotional state. Emma was trying to be brave for her mother, but David could see his daughter's distress clearly. The superhero game that had obviously brought them joy was being ruined by strangers who had no understanding of what that game meant to a little girl whose father was deployed overseas. The blonde teenager's voice carried clearly across the store. Maybe she thinks if she dresses like a superhero, someone will actually notice her. Desperate much. That was enough. David moved with the silent precision he had learned in special operations, approaching from an angle that kept him out of the teenager's peripheral vision until he was close enough to speak. He didn't announce his presence with dramatic gestures or raised voice. Instead, he simply materialized beside the group like he had stepped out of thin air. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen without understanding why. The teenagers turned, and David got his first good look at the people who had been tormenting his family. They were younger than he had initially thought, probably no older than 17, with the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences for their actions. "Yeah," the blonde girl said, irritation evident in her voice. "What do you want?" David's appearance was unremarkable at first glance. Medium height, athletic build, short brown hair, wearing civilian clothes that gave no hint of his profession. But something in his posture and the way he held eye contact made the teenagers unconsciously step back. "I want you to explain to me," David said, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that made other customers in line turn to look. "What's funny about a mother spending time with her daughter?" The teenagers exchanged glances, suddenly less sure of themselves. The blonde girl rallied first, apparently deciding that one adult wasn't enough to intimidate them. "Look, we're not doing anything wrong," she said. "It's a free country. We can say whatever we want." "You absolutely can," David agreed. "And I can explain to you why you shouldn't." Something in his tone made the boy nearest to him take another step backward. David's voice hadn't risen, but there was something underneath it that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. "Who are you anyway?" another teenager demanded. "Her bodyguard?" David glanced toward the checkout line, where Sarah was now being served by the cashier. She hadn't noticed him yet, focused on completing their transaction and getting Emma away from the situation. When he looked back at the teenagers, his expression had hardened. "I'm her husband," he said simply. "And that little girl they're laughing at? She's my daughter." The change in atmosphere was immediate. The teenagers' confident swagger evaporated as they realized they were no longer dealing with a random stranger offering unwanted advice. They were facing someone with a personal stake in their behavior. "We didn't know," one of the boys mumbled, but David continued as if he hadn't spoken. "That woman you've been calling crazy and desperate," he said, his voice still controlled but carrying an intensity that made people around them stop their own conversations to listen, "has been raising our daughter alone for 8 months while I was deployed overseas. She's managed our household, dealt with emergencies, helped our 5-year-old understand why Daddy couldn't be there for bedtime stories, and scraped knees and bad dreams." The blonde girl opened her mouth to respond, but David wasn't finished. "That cape you think is so hilarious? It's part of the game they play together. My daughter convinced her mother to be a superhero today because that's how she copes with having a father who's gone more than he's home. And You know what that makes my wife? It makes her the strongest person I know. The teenagers were silent now, their earlier bravado completely deflated. Other customers in the area had stopped pretending they weren't listening, and several were nodding in agreement with David's words. Sir, one of the boys started, you didn't mean to hurt anyone, David finished for him. But you did. You took a happy moment between a mother and daughter and turned it into something shameful. You made a 5-year-old question whether it's okay to play and use her imagination. You made a woman who has sacrificed more than you can possibly understand feel embarrassed for bringing joy into her child's life. David stepped closer to the group, and his voice dropped even lower. I've spent the last 8 months in places where people fight and die for the freedom you just used to mock my family. I've seen what real courage looks like, and I've seen what happens when people choose cruelty over kindness. The teenagers were visibly uncomfortable now, looking around as if hoping for an escape route. But David wasn't blocking their path. He was simply making sure they understood the full weight of their actions. Now, he continued, you have a choice. You can apologize to my wife and daughter, or you can continue being the kind of people who think it's entertaining to tear others down. But either way, you're going to learn that actions have consequences. The blonde girl found her voice again, though it was much smaller than before. What kind of consequences? David's smile was cold. The kind that come from making the wrong choice when you had the opportunity to do the right thing. At that moment, Sarah's voice carried from the checkout lane. David! She had turned around during their transaction and spotted him, her face showing a mixture of shock, joy, and confusion. Emma's head whipped around at the sound of her father's name, and her eyes went wide when she saw him. Daddy! Emma shrieked, loud enough to be heard throughout half the store. David's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The intensity and barely controlled anger disappeared, replaced by pure joy at seeing his family. But before he moved toward them, he turned back to the teenagers one last time. That's my daughter, he said simply. That's the little girl whose day you try to ruin. Look at her face, and tell me if you think what you did was worth it. Emma was bouncing in a shopping cart, trying to get down to run to her father. Sarah was fumbling with her wallet, clearly torn between finishing the transaction and rushing to embrace her husband. The joy and love radiating from both of them was visible to everyone in the store. The teenagers looked at this reunion, at the pure happiness of a family being reunited, and seemed to finally understand what their cruelty had almost destroyed. The blonde girl's face had gone pale, and one of the boys was staring at his shoes. We're sorry, the girl whispered, though her words were directed more at her feet than at David. Don't tell me, David said. Tell them. He gestured towards Sarah and Emma, but the teenagers seemed frozen, uncertain how to approach the family they had been mocking moments earlier. David didn't wait for their decision. He walked toward his wife and daughter, leaving the teenagers to wrestle with their consciences. As he moved away from them, his entire presence softened, the military bearing giving way to the eager anticipation of a father who had been away from his family for too long. Surprise, he said when he reached Sarah, his voice tender now, filled with all the emotion he had kept contained during the confrontation. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. You're early. You said Thursday. Mission completed ahead of schedule, David replied, gathering both his wife and daughter into an embrace that made several nearby customers smile. I wanted to surprise you. Emma was chattering excitedly, trying to tell him about their superhero shopping adventure, about the cape, about everything that had happened. David listened with the focused attention of a father who had missed months of such conversations. And Mom was wearing the cape, just like a real superhero, Emma concluded, but some people were being mean about it. David looked into Sarah's eyes and saw the exhaustion and hurt she had been hiding. He also saw relief at having him home and gratitude for his intervention with the teenagers. Without speaking, they communicated everything that needed to be said about what had just happened. Well, David said, adjusting the cape on Sarah's shoulders with gentle hands, you look like the most beautiful superhero I've ever seen. And, Emma, thank you for taking such good care of Mom while I was away. The teenagers were still standing in line behind them, subdued and uncertain. David could feel their presence, but chose to focus on his family instead. The lesson they would learn from this encounter was up to them. The atmosphere in Miller's grocery had shifted dramatically. What had been a space filled with tension and cruelty just moments before now hummed with the energy of a family reunion. Sarah finished paying for their groceries with shaking hands, still processing the fact that David was actually there, actually home, standing beside their cart, and listening to Emma's excited chatter about their superhero shopping adventure. But the teenagers remained in line behind them, and David was keenly aware of their presence. As a Navy SEAL commander, he understood that teaching moments came in many forms, and this was one that could shape how these young people approached the rest of their lives. Emma, David said, kneeling down to his daughter's eye level, can you tell me more about being superheroes with Mom? Emma launched into an enthusiastic explanation of their game, her earlier distress forgotten in the joy of having her father home. She described how they had planned their superhero identities, chosen their mission to save the world through proper grocery shopping, and how much fun they had been having until some people started being mean. David listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest in every detail of their adventure. His focus on Emma was complete, but it also served another purpose. It demonstrated to everyone watching, including the teenagers, what real attention and care looked like. You know what I think? David said when Emma finished her story. I think you and Mom are the bravest superheroes I know. It takes real courage to be yourselves and bring joy to the world, especially when other people don't understand. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but these were different tears: relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love for this man who had returned at exactly the right moment and known exactly what to say. The blonde teenager, who had been the ringleader of the earlier cruelty, stepped forward hesitantly. Her friends remained clustered behind her, but she seemed to have found some courage of her own. "Excuse me," she said, her voice much smaller than it had been during her earlier performance. David stood and turned toward her, his expression neutral but not hostile. Sarah instinctively moved closer to him, Emma still chattering about superheroes from her perch in the shopping cart. "Yes," David said simply. The girl struggled with her words, clearly uncomfortable but determined to speak. We wanted to apologize to your wife and daughter. What we said was wrong." She looked past David to Sarah, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Ma'am, I'm sorry we laughed at you. You look really nice in your cape, and we shouldn't have said those things." Sarah studied the teenager's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Thank you for apologizing," she said quietly. "That means a lot." One of the boys stepped forward next, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "We didn't think about how our words might hurt people. We were just, I don't know, being stupid, I guess." "You weren't being stupid," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to teaching important lessons. "You were being cruel. There's a difference. Stupidity is an accident. Cruelty is a choice." The teenagers absorbed this distinction, visibly uncomfortable but unable to argue with its truth. "You want to know what I learned in the military?" David continued, his tone shifting slightly to become more instructional than confrontational. "I learned that character isn't measured by how you act when everyone is watching and judging. It's measured by how you treat people when you think there won't be any consequences." Emma had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus that children bring to adult conversations they sense are important. "Daddy," she piped up, "why were they being mean to Mom?" The question hung in the air, directed innocently at her father, but heard by everyone in the vicinity. David looked down at his daughter, then back at the teenagers. "That's a good question, sweetheart. Maybe they can answer it." The blonde girl looked stricken. Faced with Emma's direct, innocent question, the motivations that had seemed so clear and justified minutes earlier appeared petty and inexplicable. "We," she started, then stopped. I don't know. I guess we thought it was funny. What was funny about it? Emma asked with the relentless curiosity of a 5-year-old. The teenager looked around at her friends, hoping for help, but they were all staring at their shoes or studying the ceiling tiles. She was on her own with this question. I guess nothing was really funny about it, she admitted finally. We were being mean because we could. Emma processed this with the seriousness she brought to all new information. That's not very nice, she concluded. Mom always says we should try to make people happy, not sad. Your mom is right, the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. David watched this exchange with professional interest. He had seen hardened soldiers learn life-changing lessons in moments of crisis. But there was something particularly powerful about watching teenagers confront their own cruelty through the eyes of an innocent child. You know what the real tragedy is? David said, addressing the group, but speaking loud enough for other customers to hear. My wife spent 8 months being both mother and father to our daughter. She managed our household, dealt with emergencies, helped Emma understand why Daddy couldn't be there for school plays and birthday parties and bedtime stories. She's one of the strongest, most resilient people I know. He paused, making sure they were listening. And today, she put on a cape to play with our daughter. She chose to be silly and joyful because that's what Emma needed. That kind of selfless love, that willingness to set aside your own self-consciousness to make your child happy, that's what real heroism looks like. Sarah felt overwhelming gratitude for David's words, but also a deep sadness that such an explanation was necessary. The teenagers were listening, though, their earlier defensiveness replaced by what appeared to be genuine reflection. We really are sorry, one of the other boys said, speaking for the first time. We didn't think about any of that stuff. We just saw someone dressed differently and thought it was okay to make fun. Why did you think that was okay? David asked, genuinely curious about their reasoning. The boy struggled with the question. I guess because everyone else was doing it, or because she couldn't really fight back. So you targeted someone you perceived as vulnerable, David summarized. Someone who wasn't in a position to defend herself effectively. The stark description of their behavior made all 4 teenagers wince. Presented that way, their actions sounded less like harmless fun and more like bullying. We weren't trying to bully anyone, the blonde girl protested, but her voice lacked conviction. What would you call it? David asked. You saw someone who was different, someone who was doing something that made them happy but seemed unusual to you, and you decided to mock them publicly until they felt ashamed. What's that if not bullying? The question forced them to confront the reality of their actions without the comfortable distance of euphemisms or excuses. They had been bullies, plain and simple. Emma, meanwhile, had been studying the teenagers with the intense observation skills of a child, trying to understand adult behavior. Are you sorry for real? She asked the blonde girl directly. The directness of the question, coming from the 5-year-old they had helped to upset, seemed to hit the teenager harder than all of David's military authority. Yes, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. I'm really, really sorry. I feel terrible about what we did. Emma nodded solemnly, then looked at her parents. Can we forgive them, Mom? Daddy always says forgiveness is important. Sarah looked at David, seeing pride in his eyes at their daughter's wisdom and compassion. Even after being hurt, Emma was willing to extend grace to those who had wronged her. Yes, sweetheart, Sarah said. We can forgive them. But David wasn't quite finished with the lesson. Forgiveness is important, he agreed, but so is understanding that our choices have consequences. You four have learned something important today, but the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? The teenagers looked uncertain about what kind of answer he was looking for. I mean, David continued, are you going to remember this feeling the next time you see someone who's different? The next time you have the opportunity to choose between kindness and cruelty? Or are you going to forget about this conversation and go back to treating people the same way you treated my family today? It was a challenge and a test wrapped in the form of a question. David was asking them to commit to being better people, not just to feel bad about their current behavior. The blonde girl spoke first. I don't want to make anyone feel the way we made your wife feel today. I'm going to remember this." Her friends nodded in agreement, though David could see varying levels of conviction in their expressions. Some lessons took longer to sink in than others, and not everyone was ready to change immediately. "Good," David said simply, "because the world needs more people who choose kindness, especially when it's difficult or when they think no one important is watching." The store manager had appeared during this conversation, clearly concerned about the disturbance, but uncertain how to intervene in what had become an impromptu life lesson. David noticed his presence and nodded respectfully. "Sorry for any disruption," David said. "We're just finishing up here." The manager, a middle-aged man who had probably seen every kind of customer drama imaginable, shook his head. "No apology necessary, sir. We appreciate customers who stand up for what's right." As if on cue, several other shoppers who had witnessed the entire encounter began to applaud. It started with the elderly woman who had been ahead of them in line, then spread to other customers who had been uncomfortable with the teenager's behavior, but hadn't known how to address it. The applause seemed to surprise everyone, including David. He hadn't been seeking recognition or praise. He had simply been protecting his family and teaching an important lesson. But the response from other customers showed how many people had been affected by what they had witnessed. Emma clapped her hands excitedly, delighted by the unexpected celebration. "Look, Daddy, everyone thinks you're a superhero too." David smiled at his daughter's interpretation of events, but his attention remained focused on the teenagers. "Remember," he told them quietly, "real heroism isn't about getting applause. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching." 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the same grocery store, this time without a cape, but with the same sense of confidence that had been restored to her on that transformative Tuesday afternoon. Emma skipped beside her, chattering about their upcoming weekend plans now that David was home permanently, his deployment rotation finally complete. The family had settled into new routines since David's return. He had been assigned to a training position that kept him stateside, allowing him to be present for the daily rhythms of family life that he had missed during his overseas deployments. Emma had blossomed with both parents consistently available, and Sarah had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried under the stress of single parenting. But the real changes extended far beyond their own family. As they moved through the produce section, Sarah noticed a familiar face sorting through apples with careful deliberation. It was Jessica, the blonde teenager who had led the mockery 6 months earlier. She looked older somehow, more thoughtful, and when she caught sight of Sarah, she immediately approached with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Mrs. Martinez?" Jessica said tentatively. "I don't know if you remember me." Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing sincerity where there had once been cruelty. "I remember you, Jessica. How are you doing?" The fact that Sarah remembered her name seemed to surprise Jessica. She had clearly expected to be forgotten or dismissed, and the simple acknowledgement of her identity as a person rather than just a source of past pain seemed to steady her. "I'm good," Jessica said, then paused. "Actually, I wanted to thank you." Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious about where this conversation was heading. "That day, when your husband talked to us, it changed something for me," Jessica continued, her words coming faster as she gained confidence. "I kept thinking about what he said, about choosing kindness over cruelty, and I realized I had been choosing cruelty a lot, not just that day, but in other situations too." Emma had been listening to this conversation with interest, and she tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Is this one of the people who was mean to us before?" Jessica knelt down to Emma's level, her movements careful and respectful. "Yes, I am. I was very mean to you and your mom, and I'm sorry about that. I learned that day that being mean doesn't make anyone feel good, not even the people doing it." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all moral questions. "Did you learn to be nicer?" "I'm trying very hard to be nicer," Jessica replied honestly. "Your dad taught me that being kind is more important than being cool or funny." "My daddy is very smart," Emma agreed. "He knows lots of things about being good." Sarah watched this interaction with fascination, seeing how Jessica's entire demeanor had changed from that day in the checkout line. The aggressive confidence had been replaced by something more genuine. Humility mixed with determination to be better. "What kind of changes have you made?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Jessica's journey since their encounter. Jessica stood up, her face brightening as she talked about something she was clearly proud of. "Well, I started volunteering at the elementary school, helping kids who are struggling with reading. And when I see other people being mean to someone, I try to speak up now instead of just going along with it." She paused, then added quietly, "It's harder than I thought it would be, standing up to people you want to like you. But I keep remembering how terrible I felt after that day, and how your husband didn't have to be nice to us, but he tried to teach us something instead of just being angry." Sarah felt a wave of emotion thinking about David's handling of that situation. He had chosen education over retaliation, understanding over anger. His military training had taught him about strategic thinking and long-term consequences, and he had applied those skills to a civilian situation with remarkable effectiveness. "Your dad was really brave," Jessica said to Emma. "Not just because he's in the military, but because he stood up for his family and then tried to help us be better people instead of just punishing us." Emma nodded sagely. "Daddy says the bravest thing is being kind when people are being mean to you." The wisdom of this 5-year-old, quoting lessons learned from her father, seemed to resonate with Jessica. "He's absolutely right," she said. As they talked, Sarah noticed other customers in the store treating each other with unusual consideration. An elderly man helped a woman reach something from a high shelf. A mother with screaming toddlers received patient smiles instead of annoyed glares from other shoppers. A teenager held the door for a customer using crutches. Sarah wondered if she was simply more attuned to kindness now, or if their very public confrontation with cruelty had somehow influenced the culture of this particular store. Sometimes single incidents created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate participants. "Mrs. Martinez," Jessica said, "could I ask you something?" "Of course. How did you stay so calm that day? When we were being horrible to you, you never lost your temper or said mean things back. How did you do that?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think it was because I learned during David's deployments that other people's opinions couldn't change who I was or what mattered to me. When you know your own worth, it's easier to stay centered when others try to tear you down." "But it must have hurt," Jessica pressed. "We were being really cruel." "It did hurt," Sarah admitted, "especially because it upset Emma. But I also knew that your behavior said more about you than it did about me. Hurt people often hurt other people. I didn't know what was going on in your lives that made cruelty seem like a reasonable choice." Jessica looked surprised by this perspective. "You thought we might be going through something difficult? I thought you might be insecure, or afraid, or dealing with pressures I didn't understand," Sarah explained. "That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps explain it, and it makes it easier to forgive." This conversation was interrupted by the arrival of David himself, pushing a cart and looking for his family. When he spotted Sarah and Emma talking with Jessica, his expression became alert but not hostile. "Dad," Emma called out. "This is Jessica. She's the one who learned to be nicer." David's face softened as he recognized the teenager. He approached with the same measured calm he had displayed 6 months earlier, but his body language conveyed openness rather than protection. "Jessica," he said with a slight nod. "Good to see you again." "Commander Martinez," Jessica replied, using his military title with obvious respect. "I want to thank you for that day. You could have just been angry with us, but you taught us something important instead." David studied her face, seeing the same changes Sarah had noticed. "What did you learn?" "That choices have consequences, and that character is measured by how we treat people when we think there won't be any accountability," Jessica recited, clearly remembering his exact words. "And that real heroism is about doing the right thing even when no one is watching." David smiled, pleased that his lessons had not only been remembered, but internalized. "Those are important concepts. How are you applying them?" Jessica described her volunteer work and her efforts to intervene when she witnessed bullying, speaking with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered purpose. David listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed genuine interest in her growth. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Jessica said near the end of their conversation. "Last week, there was a new girl at school who dressed kind of differently. Some of my old friends started making comments about her, the same kind of stuff we said about your wife that day. But instead of joining in or just staying quiet, I told them to stop. I said it wasn't funny and that the girl seemed nice and we should give her a chance." Emma clapped her hands. "That was very brave." "It was brave," David agreed. "Standing up to peer pressure is one of the most difficult things anyone can do, especially teenagers." "I'm impressed." The validation from David seemed to mean a great deal to Jessica. She had clearly been working hard to become a better person, and having her efforts recognized by someone she respected gave weight to her transformation. "There's something else," Jessica added, looking slightly nervous. "I convinced my friends from that day to volunteer with me at the elementary school. We're all working with kids now, trying to be positive role models instead of what we were before." This news surprised both Sarah and David. The ripple effect of that grocery store confrontation had extended to influence 4 teenagers' life choices, potentially affecting hundreds of elementary school children who would benefit from their mentorship. "That's remarkable," Sarah said sincerely. "Those children are lucky to have you." "We're lucky to have them," Jessica corrected. "Working with kids reminds you how important it is to be kind. They watch everything adults do and copy it. That's a big responsibility." As they prepared to part ways, Jessica hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more, but unsure how to express it. "What is it?" David asked gently. I wanted you to know that what happened that day didn't just change how I treat other people. It changed how I think about service and sacrifice. I'm considering joining the military after college. I want to do something meaningful with my life, something that helps protect people like you do." David's expression grew serious. Military service was not a decision to be made lightly, and he wanted to ensure Jessica understood the full scope of what she was considering. "Military service is a significant commitment," he said carefully. "It requires sacrifice not just from you, but from your family. It means putting other people's safety and freedom ahead of your own comfort and security." "I know," Jessica replied. "But that day, watching you protect your family and then choose to teach us instead of just being angry, it showed me what leadership looks like, what courage looks like. I want to be someone who stands up for people who can't stand up for themselves." The conversation that had begun with a teenage bully apologizing had evolved into something much more profound, a discussion about life purpose, service, and the ripple effects of moral courage. Sarah marveled at the unexpected turns life could take when people chose growth over defensiveness. Emma, who had been listening to this adult conversation with remarkable patience, finally spoke up. "Jessica, do you want to be a superhero too?" Jessica laughed, but her answer was serious. "You know what, Emma? I think maybe I do. Just not the cape-wearing kind. The kind that helps people and stands up for what's right. That's the best kind," Emma declared with authority. "Right, Mom." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Jessica, then at David. "That's exactly the best kind," she agreed. As they finally said their goodbyes and continued their respective shopping trips, Sarah reflected on the long journey from that humiliating afternoon to this moment of redemption and growth. What had begun as an attack on her family had become a catalyst for positive change that extended far beyond their immediate circle. That evening, as David helped Emma with her bedtime routine, Sarah found herself thinking about the nature of heroism. The cape she had worn that day had been a playful costume, but the real heroism had come from David's measured response to cruelty, from her own resilience in the face of humiliation, from Emma's willingness to forgive, and from Jessica's choice to transform shame into purpose. True heroism, she realized, wasn't about supernatural powers or dramatic gestures. It was about ordinary people choosing to be extraordinary in moments that mattered creating ripples of positive change that could influence lives in ways they might never fully know. The grocery store had returned to its normal rhythm of mundane Tuesday afternoons, but Sarah knew that some changes were permanent. Every time someone chose kindness over cruelty, every time a former bully stood up for someone being targeted, every time a child received encouragement from a teenage volunteer, the world became a little bit better. And sometimes Sarah thought as she listened to David reading Emma a bedtime story about brave princesses and noble knights, that was how real change happened. Not through grand declarations or dramatic confrontations, but through the accumulated weight of countless small choices to be better than we were yesterday. Heroes, she had learned, don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear military uniforms, sometimes they wear everyday clothes, and sometimes they're 5-year-old girls teaching adults about forgiveness. But they all share the same commitment to standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, especially when it matters most.